Supernatural belief, pathology, contagion, or collective delusion. Part 1 of 5. Religious and supernatural beliefs have long been scrutinized through scientific and secular lenses. Some theorists, from classical thinkers like Freud to modern skeptics, have provocatively framed devout belief as a kind of mental pathology or a widespread irrational delusion. Others have described religion as a virus of the mind, spreading culturally much like an infectious disease. This report examines these contentious frameworks in turn: the hypothesis that religion is a form of mental illness, the idea of religion as a social contagion, memes and mass psychology, and the notion of religious belief as a mass delusion akin to conspiracy theories or pseudoscience. For each theory, we will evaluate the supporting arguments, empirical evidence, criticisms, and limitations. The analysis is rooted in scientific naturalism and unflinching rationality, yet mindful of human psychological complexity, reflecting the Mystrikal ethos of epistemic humility, honesty, and justice. Religion as a mental illness? Historical and psychoanalytic perspectives. The idea that religion might be a collective mental disorder has deep historical roots. Sigmund Freud famously argued that religious belief is essentially neurotic, calling religion the universal obsessional neurosis of humanity. In The Future of an Illusion, 1927, Freud likened religious rituals and dogmas to childhood neuroses, irrational compulsions created by psychological conflict. He theorized that just as a child's mind uses fantasy to cope with fear and helplessness, humanity invented God as a protective father figure, an illusion born of wish fulfillment. Other early critics, such as philosopher Karl Marx, described religion as an illusory comfort for oppressed people, the opium of the people, implicitly comparing it to a drug that dulls reality. More recently, outspoken atheists like Richard Dawkins have echoed this sentiment in a modern idiom. Dawkins argues that belief in a personal God qualifies as a delusion, a persistent false belief held in the face of strong contradictory evidence. He even approvingly cites writer Robert Pirsig's quip that when one person suffers from a delusion, it is called insanity. When many people suffer from a delusion, it is called religion. This provocative line captures the essence of the religion as illness hypothesis, namely, that what we call faith is, in substance, a culturally accepted form of delusional thinking. Religious belief versus delusion in psychiatry. From a clinical psychology standpoint, however, equating religion with mental illness is highly controversial. Psychiatry distinguishes private hallucinations or delusions from socially shared beliefs. By definition, a delusion in the DSM, Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, is a fixed false belief not shared by one's culture or subculture. In fact, DSM-4 explicitly notes that an article of religious faith does not count as a delusion. This cultural exception means that a person devoutly believing in culturally normative miracles, spirits, or divine beings is not diagnosed as psychotic by virtue of those beliefs alone. Clinicians recognize that content matters less than context. Bizarre convictions are only deemed pathological if they're idiosyncratic and accompanied by impairment. As one psychiatrist put it, faith of itself is not a delusion, even if similar themes, voices of God, divine missions, can appear in genuine psychotic delusions. For example, suppose a man believes he is literally God, or is receiving secret commands from the TV. In that case, that individual's belief might signal psychosis, but millions of people attending church weekly to worship God are not considered mentally ill. Key differences include insight and flexibility. Typically, religious individuals understand that others may not share their faith, and they compartmentalize their beliefs without severe dysfunction in other areas of life. By contrast, a delusional patient typically lacks insight and may have trouble functioning because of their false beliefs. In short, modern psychiatry generally views mainstream religious belief as a non-pathological phenomenon, a culturally held shared belief, not a clinical delusion. As a 2020 review bluntly noted, a definition of delusion that pathologizes most of the world's people would be clinically worthless. Psychotic and obsessive-compulsive features. Although everyday faith is not labeled a disorder, there are well-documented overlaps between religious belief and known mental illnesses. One overlap is content. Studies find that religious themes are common in psychosis. Perhaps as many as 60% of those with schizophrenia have religious grandiose delusions, auditory hallucinations of God, demonic voices, and so on. In such cases, the mental illness is primary. The person has schizophrenia or bipolar disorder, and it co-opts religious imagery or ideas. Another overlap is obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD. A specific OCD subtype called scrupulosity manifests as pathological religious guilt and ritualism. Patients with scrupulosity experience tormenting obsessions about sin, blasphemy, or moral purity, and perform compulsive prayers or confession to relieve the anxiety. This goes far beyond normal piety. It is an illness, an anxiety disorder, which exploits religious fear as its medium. Historically, extreme ascetic practices or hyperreligiosity in particular saints could be reinterpreted as symptoms of what we now call OCD or other disorders, though such retrospective diagnoses are speculative. Neuroscience and hyperreligiosity. Neurological case studies have also fueled the religion as pathology debate. Certain brain conditions can induce intense religious experiences or fixations. A famous example is temporal-lobe epilepsy, TLE. Some people with TLE exhibit the Gestalt-Geschwind syndrome, a personality change marked by excessive religiosity, writing obsessively, hypergraphia, and peculiar ethical hyperconscientiousness. In the 1970s, neurologists Waxman and Geschwind described how TLE patients often develop an intense preoccupation with mystical or religious ideas, a phenomenon of hyperreligiosity. There is speculation that historical figures, for example St. Paul on the road to Damascus, might have had epileptic visions mistaken for divine revelation. Likewise, neuroscientist Michael Persinger famously used a God helmet, transcranial magnetic stimulation, to induce in subjects the feeling of a presence in the room, mimicking a religious experience. Such findings suggest that spiritual feelings can be triggered or modulated by brain activity, hinting at a neurological basis for some supernatural perceptions. However, whether this makes religion a brain disorder is a matter of interpretation. It could simply mean that our brains are capable of generating numinous experiences through temporal-lobe circuits or dopamine-mediated pattern detection without any need to invoke the supernatural. From the naturalistic perspective of a Mystrik, these studies demystify religious experiences by showing they are products of brain chemistry. Still, they do not imply that all believers have a damaged or abnormal brain. Instead, they illustrate that extremes of religiosity, hearing voices, seeing visions, can sometimes have pathological roots. Strengths of the pathology. Hypothesis. Proponents of the religion as mental illness framework point to these overlaps and analogies to argue that devout believers and psychiatric patients differ only by degree and social context. A few supportive points often cited include parallels in content. Believers may report miracles, divine voices, or spiritual warfare, claims that resemble hallucinations or delusions in form. In both cases, there is a firm belief in phenomena that others find unbelievable. This parallel is what led Dawkins to dub God a delusion in the common sense, non-clinical usage. Likewise, Steven Pinker has called belief in an afterlife a malignant delusion, in that it can encourage believers to downplay real-world risks. Psychological crutches. Religion might function as an obsessive coping mechanism, a way to manage fear, guilt, or uncertainty, much as an anxiety disorder patient uses ritual to cope. Freud's theory of religion as a neurotic illusion falls here. Faith is a fantasy shield against reality's trauma, analogous to how a neurotic symptom provides illusory comfort. Harmful extremes. In some cases, strong religious belief clearly harms an individual's functioning. For example, people refusing medical treatment for a child because of faith-healing beliefs, or individuals suffering intense terror of hellfire, religious trauma. Such cases show belief can cross into clinically significant distress or impairment, meeting a key criterion of mental illness. Indeed, the proposed, though unofficial diagnosis, religious trauma syndrome, has been discussed to describe psychological damage from extremist indoctrination. Continuum with psychosis. The fact that many psychotic patients have religious delusions suggests a continuum. The content of religiosity easily becomes pathological if the individual loses reality testing. This is consistent with the idea that religion exploits cognitive weak spots that, in a more extreme form, become psychiatric symptoms. Criticisms and limitations. Despite surface similarities, the consensus in psychology is that ordinary religious belief is not a mental disorder. There are several strong criticisms of the pathology hypothesis, lack of dysfunction in most believers. The vast majority of religious people function normally in daily life. They distinguish metaphor from reality. Praying, "Jesus, live in my heart," is understood spiritually, not as literal anatomy, and they do not make maladaptive choices en masse that would indicate impaired reality testing. In clinical terms, their beliefs do not cause significant distress or disability. In fact, often the opposite. Many find comfort and community in religion. Calling such persons ill stretches the definition of illness beyond usefulness. Cultural relativity and shared belief. A core issue is that if one person believes something fantastic, we might label it delusional. Still, if millions believe it, it becomes religion or culture. Psychiatrists value the cultural background clause precisely because it prevents overdiagnosis. As Ross and McKay note, it would be absurdly arbitrary to say a belief ceases to be a delusion once widely adopted. Yet that's essentially how we distinguish saints from madmen. In practice, pathologizing a belief held by billions, for example, God created the world, doesn't help clinically or scientifically. It would label entire societies as insane, which yields no meaningful intervention. The founders of new religions might, in a vacuum, seem delusional at first. For example, Joseph Smith claiming angelic golden plates. Still, once they gain a following, their claims enter the realm of socially accepted narrative. Thus, from a social science perspective, calling religion a mental illness confuses a socio-cultural phenomenon with a medical one. Empirical evidence of benefits. Critics also point out that religion is not uniformly harmful or maladaptive. In fact, a large body of research correlates religious involvement with certain mental health benefits, or at least protective factors. For example, a meta-analysis of older adults found that high religiosity/spirituality was associated with lower rates of depression and anxiety and greater life satisfaction. Other studies have found that, on average, religious affiliation and practice can provide social support, coping mechanisms, and a sense of meaning that buffer stress. While these correlational findings don't prove religion is inherently good, they demonstrate that it's not uniformly a disease either. Many believers thrive because of their faith, not despite it. Any theory casting religion purely as pathology must grapple with these positive outcomes. Philosophical category error. Finally, philosophers argue that treating religious belief as an illness is a category mistake. A delusion in psychiatry is an incorrect factual belief about the world. For example, Martians are controlling my thoughts. But many religious beliefs are not strictly factual propositions that can be tested. They're matters of faith, metaphor, or ethical worldview. To call love of God, or a search for meaning, mental illness, arguably misuses the medical concept of illness. It ignores the existential dimension of religion, that it addresses moral and existential questions, not just empirical ones. Even an atheist philosopher can recognize that religious narratives fulfill psychological and social functions distinct from the symptoms of, say, schizophrenia or OCD. In short, labeling religion as mental illness may be more a polemical stance than a scientifically validated one. The mainstream view in both psychiatry and anthropology is that typical religious belief is within the spectrum of normal human behavior, shaped by culture and cognitive tendencies, and only becomes pathological in extreme, isolated cases. Mystrikism's retort. From a mystical perspective, the fact that most believers function adequately in daily life does not absolve supernatural belief from being a dysfunction at the level of truth-seeking. True, conventional psychiatry wisely avoids labeling billions of people delusional. Normalcy and cultural reinforcement shield religious faith from clinical diagnosis. Yet Mystrikism contends that an entire culture can normalize an epistemological illness, much as pre-modern societies normalized humoral theory or witch panics. The validity of a belief isn't determined by how common or comforting it is. It's determined by evidence. Widespread acceptance merely makes an irrational belief culturally invisible as a pathology, not healthy in the rational sense. History offers stark examples. Virtually everyone once believed the sun orbited the earth, a false belief enshrined as common sense. Its ubiquity didn't make it true. It only made the eventual correction more challenging. Similarly, a supernatural claim isn't immunized from critical scrutiny by the number of adherents. In Mystrikism's view, even if faith in unseen gods doesn't typically disrupt one's ability to hold a job or raise a family, it does represent a maladaptive glitch in our truth-processing system, a pocket of socially sanctioned delusion that can flare into harm under the wrong conditions. We see it as an illness in our collective epistemology, often dormant or benign in individuals, but dangerous in the aggregate and in certain extremes. Importantly, pointing this out isn't an attack on individual believers' sanity or goodness. Mystriks target the belief system and its epistemic flaws, not by mocking the person, but by challenging the notion that accepting unfounded claims is ever truly harmless. Yes, many religious people distinguish metaphor from reality and compartmentalize their faith. But consider what that implies. They must compartmentalize it to function. The core supernatural claims, resurrections, divine judgments, magical interventions, are siloed off from the rigorous evidence testing they apply in the rest of life, jobs, health, and so on. That very isolation is evidence that such beliefs don't play by the usual rules of reality. This compartmentalization may prevent daily dysfunction, but it leaves a believer holding contradictions, effectively tolerating a pocket of delusion because it is culturally endorsed. Mystrikism argues that this cognitive partition, even if stable for many, is not ideal or virtuous. It's a subtle internal inconsistency or double standard where one area of life is exempted from the standards of reason applied elsewhere. While the devout banker, plumber, or teacher might be perfectly normal outwardly, the fact that they accept sacred stories at face value, yet demand evidence in every other domain, is a symptom of a broader human mental divide that deserves remedy, not a free pass. We don't call such people insane. Still, we do say they are indoctrinated into a consensual delusion, one that, at scale, renders society vulnerable to fanaticism and blocks our collective commitment to truth. The positive functions of religion, community, comfort, moral orientation are fully acknowledged by Mystrikism, but we maintain that these can be achieved without believing falsehoods. Yes, studies find correlations between religiosity and well-being in some cases, but these benefits, social support, stress relief, charitable outlook, stem from human connection and psychology, not the factual truth of any supernatural doctrine. In other words, it's the community and mindset around religion doing the heavy lifting, not the literal accuracy of its claims. A church potluck or shared prayer circle can bring happiness, not because God actually hears prayers, but because humans thrive on fellowship and hope. Mystrikism seeks to preserve those human goods while removing the distortions of faith. We argue that relying on an illusion, however consoling, is ultimately a fragile foundation. The same faith that comforts can also traumatize or mislead. For example, terrifying someone with hellfire imagery, a phenomenon so real it has prompted the term religious trauma syndrome for extreme cases of indoctrination-induced PTSD, or convincing parents to refuse medical care for a child in favor of prayer. These harms may occur in a minority of cases, but they highlight that the line between benign and malign manifestations of belief is thin. A belief system that sanctions miracles and divine intervention lays the groundwork for dangerous decisions. For example, treating illness with faith alone, expecting the apocalypse instead of caring for the environment, and so on. Even moderate believers, who are often kind and rational in many respects, provide a cultural cover that grants extremist interpretations legitimacy. Mystriks feel a principled disgust toward the injustices and suffering perpetuated by such faith-based errors, whether it's a child dying from a curable illness because prayer was chosen over medicine, or entire communities demonized as infidels. Our moral calculus says comfort is not an absolute good if purchased at the cost of truth and innocent well-being. Therefore, even the gentle, adaptive sides of religion are double-edged. They soothe, yes, but also inculcate a habit of credulity, accepting things on faith, that can be exploited by charlatans and zealots. We aim to break that chain by promoting communities of support and meaning grounded in reality, where solace doesn't require self-deception. As for the charge of category error, that calling religion an illness misconstrues its nature, Mystrikism offers a nuanced rebuttal. We agree that religion addresses existential yearnings and moral ideas. It's not merely a set of propositional claims to test in a lab, but it does involve factual assertions about the universe. For example, a soul survives death, a deity created the world, miracles happen. These are claims about reality. To the extent that a religion makes any real-world assertion, even a metaphysical one about an afterlife or divine will, that assertion can be evaluated as true or false. Mystrikism refuses to carve out a magical exemption for these claims. We hold them to the same epistemic standard as any other hypothesis. When they consistently fail, no evidence of souls, no reliable miracles, no supernatural phenomena surviving scientific scrutiny, we conclude they are unsupported at best, false at worst. In that sense, persisting in such unfounded beliefs can be understood not as evidence of a brain disorder, but as a culturally transmitted cognitive dysfunction, a systematic bias in our evidence processing. In other words, it's a form of mass cognitive distortion, somewhat like a perceptual bias that makes one see things that aren't there. Labeling it an illness might be a blunt metaphor, but it underscores the seriousness with which we view the distortion of reality that faith encourages. We are not saying that believers suffer from a neurological illness. Instead, the complex of faith-based ideas can be seen as a self-propagating cultural meme that exploits our brain's natural tendencies, pattern-seeking, death anxiety, social conformity. In this sense, the beliefs hijack cognitive traits, much like any persistent idea that spreads through society rather than indicating any literal disease. It's symptomatic of our brain's vulnerabilities, our propensity to seek patterns, fear death, and conform to community, and it can hijack those traits much like a virus hijacks a cell. A culturally accepted delusion is still a delusion when viewed in the cold light of evidence. When we use words like delusion or say we diagnose a false belief, we do not mean a clinical psychiatric diagnosis. We mean simply recognizing that a belief is unsupported by evidence. For example, diagnose here means identify or call out a mistaken belief, not perform a medical evaluation. So while anthropologists and psychiatrists may not diagnose your praying grandmother as insane, rightly so, the content of what she believes, angels, demons, an invisible savior, and so on, squarely belongs to the domain of the unproven and implausible. Just to be clear, we aren't using terms like insane or psychosis in a medical sense. Mystrikism does not regard religious experience as actual mental illness. Instead, it critiques the epistemic content of certain beliefs. Any use of insanity is illustrative, for example, quoting others, and not an actual label for people of faith. Mystrikism's stance is that we should gently, compassionately help future generations outgrow these inherited fantasies, much as we outgrew beliefs in Zeus's thunderbolts or witches on broomsticks, even if those were once significant cultural narratives. Crucially, we do not advocate dehumanizing or mocking individuals of faith. A mystrik extends empathy to the believer, seeing them as a fellow human navigating a confusing world, often finding genuine solace and identity in their belief. We hate the illness, not the patient. Our critique of supernatural belief is principled, not personal. It is driven by a desire for justice and well-being. We recoil at the injustices done in God's name and feel morally bound to prevent avoidable suffering. This is our sense of justice. And that means challenging doctrines that perpetuate harm. At the same time, our compassion reminds us that believers often don't hold their views out of malice or stupidity, but due to upbringing, social pressure, or personal pain that faith salves. Therefore, Mystrikism treats unfounded ideas as the problem, much like a public health issue, while remaining compassionate and respectful toward individuals who hold them. We focus on changing the underlying misconceptions through education and dialogue, rather than labeling or shaming anyone. We use terms like disease here purely metaphorically to highlight the need to correct harmful false beliefs, not to imply any literal infection or pathology in people. In practice, this means we encourage questioning and provide better answers rather than shaming anyone. Just as a therapist wouldn't ridicule a patient's harmful coping mechanism, but would still firmly work to change it, we aim to replace faith-based consolations with reality-based hope. We envision a world where people can find meaning, community, and comfort without clinging to unfounded claims. A world where our shared commitment to truth is so strong that comforting lies no longer tempt us. Mystrikism may sometimes use the word illness metaphorically to emphasize that there is a systemic, socially reinforced epistemic impairment in how unfounded beliefs influence the mind. These beliefs are better understood as a form of cultural psychological dysfunction or mass cognitive distortion, a persistent phenomenon shaped by tradition and group dynamics rather than a literal medical condition. Accordingly, Mystrikism aims to address and remedy this epistemic dysfunction through education, empathy, and evidence-based dialogue, not through coercion, stigma, or treating individuals as if they were patients. To clarify explicitly, Mystrikism sees supernatural and religious beliefs as culturally inherited cognitive biases or distortions, not as typical psychiatric disorders. They are socially reinforced epistemic impairments, serious in their effects on decision-making and perception, but fundamentally different from an individual's personal psychopathology. This perspective emphasizes the role of group dynamics, tradition, and meme-like transmission in perpetuating these beliefs. Supernatural belief, pathology, contagion, or collective delusion. Part 2 of 5. Religion as a social contagion. Memes and mass psychology. Another framework casts religious belief not as individual psychopathology, but as a contagious social phenomenon, essentially a mind virus. Just to be clear, terms like virus, infection, disease, and contagion are used metaphorically to describe how ideas spread through culture, not to imply that believers have any literal illness. Mystrikism views supernatural beliefs as socially transmitted cognitive patterns, cultural memes or biases, not as biological pathogens. This idea gained prominence with evolutionary biologist Richard Dawkins's concept of memes. In his 1976 book, The Selfish Gene, Dawkins proposed that ideas can propagate and evolve in a population much like genes do, by natural selection. He coined the term meme for a self-replicating unit of culture, tunes, phrases, beliefs, and so on. Dawkins later specifically described organized religions as particularly successful and harmful memes. In a 1991 essay titled Viruses of the Mind, he argued that religions spread by hijacking cognitive mechanisms and infecting people's minds, analogously to how a virus infects a host. From this memetic perspective, a religion is a complex of ideas, rituals, and injunctions that encourage its hosts to spread it to others, often at the host's expense. Susan Blackmore, a psychologist and memeticist, summarized this view. Religions begin as byproducts, but then evolve and spread, like viruses, using humans to propagate themselves for their own benefit and to the detriment of the people they infect. In this analogy, scriptures and doctrines carry copy-me instructions, for example, commands to evangelize or to raise one's children in the faith, and they often use emotional threats and promises, for example, hellfire for non-believers, heavenly reward for believers, to ensure their own transmission. The virus benefits by spreading, while the human host may pay significant costs, time, money, health risks, such as refusing medical care or engaging in dangerous rites, all to further the meme. Memes and cultural epidemiology. The virus of the mind model is a subset of a broader approach that treats ideas as infectious. In cultural epidemiology, a term used by anthropologist Dan Sperber, beliefs and behaviors spread through populations in patterns analogous to disease outbreaks. For example, one can track the rise of a cult or a new religious movement as one would track an epidemic, identifying patient zero, modes of transmission, proselytizing, parent-to-child transmission, media, and so on, and factors that make individuals susceptible to conversion. Some cognitive scientists argue that human brains have vulnerabilities that certain memes exploit. Religion, by this view, capitalizes on cognitive biases. We have a hyperactive agent detection, predisposing us to see intentional agents behind natural events, a propensity for imitating prestigious or authoritative figures, and a comfort in cohesive narratives. A contagious idea that promises eternal life or explains why bad things happen, attributing them to supernatural agents, can spread because it taps into these predispositions. In group settings, this spread can be accelerated by social contagion processes, emotional contagion, collective fear or euphoria, conformity pressures, and repetitive ritual can reinforce the meme's grip. Classic crowd psychology studies, for example, Gustave Le Bon's work in the 1890s, showed that individuals in a crowd can become highly suggestible and prone to imitative behavior, fertile ground for a shared belief to take root and propagate. In religious history, one can find episodes like the medieval Children's Crusade or various revivalist Great Awakenings, where zealotry spread rapidly through emotional preaching and group fervor, almost like a mass psychogenic outbreak. Modern theorists like Blackmore and Dennett, in Breaking the Spell, note that successful religious memes often incorporate self-protective tricks akin to how viruses evade immune systems. For instance, memes may discourage rational scrutiny by labeling doubt as sin, or they may encourage believers to cut off contact with unclean unbelievers, thereby quarantining the host from contrary ideas. They propagate via family and community networks, much as viruses exploit close contact, and sometimes even mutate into new sects and denominations to adapt to new environments. From the meme contagion viewpoint, it's no coincidence that religions emphasize evangelism and high birth rates. These behaviors maximize transmission, much like a virus that makes you sneeze, which is more likely to spread to new hosts. Indeed, empirical data show that in many societies, religious individuals have higher fertility rates than non-religious individuals, thereby passing on both their genes and their beliefs at a higher rate. This reproductive success of religious groups, for example, the exponential growth of the Amish community, suggests that, at the population level, religious memes are very competitive. Strengths of the memetic contagion model. Viewing religion as a contagious meme or virus provides a naturalistic explanation for how complex false beliefs can persist and dominate entire societies. Some strengths and supportive points include: explains spread and persistence. The meme model directly addresses transmission. It explains why children often inherit their parents' religion, why religions that aggressively proselytize, like Christianity and Islam, historically outcompeted more insular faiths, and why specific ideas, hell, salvation, prophecy, recur across cultures, because those ideas are catchy and self-replicating. It shifts focus from whether the beliefs are true to how they spread, which is a fruitful perspective for anthropology and sociology. Accounts for mind tricks. The analogy highlights tactics that religions use, consciously or not, to ensure survival. Promises of eternal reward, which make the meme subjectively valuable to the host. Threats against apostasy, which deter hosts from dropping the meme. Rituals and repetitive prayer, which reinforce the meme in memory, and so on. These can be seen as evolutionary strategies of the meme. For example, a meme that says, "It is your sacred duty to convert others," will spread faster than one that says, "Keep your beliefs to yourself." Thus, memetics gives a plausible reason why many religions compel outreach, and why those that didn't, say certain esoteric cults, remained small or died out. Interdisciplinary appeal. The social contagion idea resonates with findings in network theory and social psychology. Research on the spread of information, fads, or even behaviors, like the spread of health behaviors or violence in social networks, often uses epidemiological models. Treating religious belief as information that can infect minds allows the use of mathematical modeling and evolutionary theory to study cultural dynamics. It's an approach that bridges biology and culture, aligning with a scientifically naturalistic worldview that even complex human ideologies can be learned like any other natural phenomenon. Illustrative examples. There are stark examples that lend themselves to the contagion metaphor. The rapid proliferation of cargo cults in the South Pacific after World War II, new religious rituals spreading from village to village, or the way New Age beliefs circulate on the internet today, shows meme-like behavior. Another poignant example is Jonestown in 1978. Over 900 members of a religious cult died in a mass murder-suicide after years of social isolation and indoctrination under Jim Jones. Such tragedies demonstrate how a virulent ideology can infect a whole community with lethal consequences. Comparing toxic religious cults to contagious epidemics, with Jim Jones as an index case infecting followers, is more than metaphor. Public health scholars have indeed studied extreme cult ideology as a kind of behavioral contagion. Criticisms and limitations. The memetic or virus model of religion, while thought-provoking, faces many criticisms and is not universally accepted. Key limitations include oversimplification of culture. Critics argue that treating complex belief systems as if they were literal viruses or gene-like entities is an oversimplification. Human beliefs do not neatly replicate as genes do. People modify, interpret, or syncretize ideas in creative ways. The meme model can sound overly deterministic, as if humans are passive carriers. In reality, people actively reason, albeit with bias, and can accept or reject elements of a religion. The meme's eye view might underplay human agency and the multi-layered nature of religious traditions, which involve art, ethics, community, and so on not just self-propagation. Culture is not a mindless virus. It's a meaningful human creation, critics say. Not all memes are maladaptive. The virus metaphor specifically emphasizes harm to the host, but is religion uniformly harmful? Memetic proponents, like Dawkins in his harsher moments, often assume religion is a net negative, analogous to a parasite sapping a host's resources. But some scholars suggest religion can be adaptive, at least in specific contexts, providing social cohesion, reducing stress through optimism or prayer, and encouraging charitable behaviors, among other benefits. In biological evolution, some viruses actually confer benefits to their hosts, symbiosis. Similarly, one could argue that certain religious beliefs enhance an individual's well-being or a group's survival prospects. For instance, data presented to Susan Blackmore showed that religious people were out-reproducing secular people in many countries. From a strict evolutionary standpoint, this means those religious memes are actually aiding their host's genetic legacy, not destroying it. Blackmore herself publicly recanted her earlier view that religion is just a virus when she saw evidence that religiosity correlates with having more children. She conceded that the virus metaphor had its day, and that religion might be better seen as either a byproduct or even an adaptive complex. The memetic theory's heavy focus on pathology is thus one-sided. It might apply well to destructive cults or extremist ideologies, but it's less convincing for moderate religiosity that coexists with health and prosperity. Scientific status of memetics. Memetics itself remains more of a metaphor or proto-theory than a rigorous science. Unlike genes, memes and their boundaries are hard to quantify. What exactly is the meme of Christianity, the whole Bible, the idea of Jesus' resurrection, the practice of baptism, or some combination? Different hosts alter the meme, so fidelity of replication is variable. While there are journals and conferences on cultural evolution, many anthropologists favor other frameworks, for example gene-culture coevolution or cognitive byproduct theories, over the simplistic meme as virus analogy. In short, memetics has not yielded the kind of predictive mathematical laws that genetics has. Culture's complexity eludes such neat treatment. Many academics view the mind virus talk as a colorful rhetorical tool rather than a settled theory. Normative bias and reception. Philosophically, calling someone's cherished religion a virus is bound to offend. It can come across as dehumanizing believers, as infected victims of a malicious code. This can shut down dialogue. The reception in scientific circles is mixed. Evolutionary theorists like Dawkins and Dennett champion the idea, but others caution that it may be just repackaging old anti-religious polemics in scientific language. Importantly, the social contagion concept can be applied to any idea, good or bad, so singling out religion as a virus may say more about the theorist's value judgments. For instance, patriotism, science, human rights, and atheism itself can all be described as self-propagating ideas, too. Dawkins was once asked if science might also be a virus of the mind. He resisted that label for ideas he sees as objectively true. This highlights a limitation. Contagion, as an explanation, doesn't assess truth or falsity. True ideas, like the germ theory of disease, also spread by social contagion. So while the model explains how an idea spreads, it doesn't necessarily explain why some false ideas endure over centuries. For that, one must delve into human needs and cognitive biases, not just the meme's trickery. Mystrikism finds the virus of the mind analogy for religion compelling as a metaphor, but we readily concede it shouldn't be the sole lens. Human culture is indeed more complex than a viral genome. People are not mindless hosts. However, the essence of the contagion model rings true. Ideas can and do spread epidemically, often bypassing critical filters. A child born into a devout community catches their faith before they ever get a chance to evaluate its truth. The doctrines, rituals, and emotional pulls of religion have evolved over centuries specifically because they are catchy. They stick in the brains and propagate from mind to mind with remarkable tenacity. That many believers later exercise some agency, accepting, rejecting, or modifying aspects of their faith, is acknowledged. Yet, we must ask why they were inclined toward those beliefs to begin with. Mystrikism answers, because those beliefs were transmitted to them in their most vulnerable formative years and continually reinforced by social proof and psychological incentives. In that light, the critique of oversimplification, that meme theory ignores human creativity, can be turned around. It is because humans are creative and cognitively rich that religions needed to evolve potent hooks. A simplistic, feeble idea wouldn't spread widely in a population of thinkers. A successful religious meme is one that cleverly entangles itself with human hopes, fears, and group dynamics. Far from denying human agency, the Contagion model presupposes a rich host. It is precisely our emotional depth and social nature that sophisticated memes exploit. Belief systems adapt to their human environment. For example, a religion might allow enough interpretative flexibility that individuals feel they are choosing their own meaning, even as the core memeplex ensures its continuity, through mandates to evangelize children, taboo against apostasy, and so on. In mystical terms, we appreciate that people aren't literally zombies. Still, we observe that even rational individuals, en masse, can be swayed by infectious ideas. Consider political propaganda or viral conspiracy theories. Religion, with its centuries of memetic optimization, is one of the most formidable viral strains in our cultural history. And pointing that out is not to demean believers, but to warn of the power these idea complexes wield over even the best of us.
It's true that not all religious memes are purely malign parasites. Some behave more like symbionts, offering benefits to the host. Mystrikism readily acknowledges the adaptive aspects of religiosity that critics of the virus model highlight. However, calling an idea adaptive is not the same as calling it true or even net beneficial for humanity's future. For instance, the observation that religious individuals often have more children, thus spreading the meme more effectively, shows that certain faith systems are evolutionarily fit. They excel at self-perpetuation. But from a mystical standpoint, this is a double-edged sword. Yes, a religion that encourages large families and discourages leaving the fold will expand. But we must ask, at what cost? Overpopulation strains resources. Insular growth can entrench tribalism. And most importantly, a meme's reproductive success is entirely orthogonal to its truth value or ethical value. Many harmful ideologies in history spread widely because they had a catchy, simplistic appeal or tapped into tribal instincts, not because they were righteous or true. The not all memes are maladaptive argument misses this key point. A false idea can confer short-term benefits or psychological comfort while still being detrimental in the broader picture of knowledge and progress. Take a concrete example. A belief that vaccines are evil might unite a community and give them a shared identity, a benefit to group cohesion, but it ultimately causes real harm through disease outbreaks. Likewise, a religious creed might boost an individual's optimism or discipline, helpful traits superficially, yet that same creed might lead them to reject life-saving medical treatments or vilify outsiders. Mystrikism weighs an idea's worth by true understanding and reduction of harm, not by how tenaciously it spreads or how happy it makes someone in a narrow sense. Even if a meme acts symbiotically in some ways, if it carries delusion at its core, it keeps us tethered to ignorance. The virus analogy bluntly spotlights this. Some viruses in nature confer benefits. For example, certain gut viruses can help immune function. But we wouldn't deliberately spread a virus just because it has a silver lining, especially not if it also, say, reduces overall cognitive function or can turn lethal under certain conditions. In the same way, Mystrikism argues we shouldn't blithely accept the spread of unverifiable supernatural beliefs just because they sometimes yield comfort or community.
We can pursue comfort and community through truthful means. We don't need to be infected by untruth to get those benefits.
Critics note that memetics is not a fully fleshed-out science, and Mystrikism concurs that we must be cautious in treating religion as a virus, as more than an illustrative framework. But there is growing scientific exploration in cultural evolution and cognitive science that supports many elements of the Contagion view. We have empirical studies of how rumors spread, how emotional contagion in crowds works, how confirmation bias and authority bias make minds fertile for specific ideas. These map closely to the memetic story. The fact that we cannot map a meme's genome like a virus's doesn't nullify the analogy's utility. It simply means human belief systems are multidimensional, requiring multiple analytic tools. Mystrikism uses memetic reasoning alongside other approaches, like psychological analysis of needs, historical context, and so on. We reject the notion that calling religion a meme is nothing but a polemic. Instead, it's a naturalistic hypothesis about how ideas endure and spread, one that can be refined with evidence. True, it doesn't produce tidy equations, but it yields testable propositions. For example, do religious doctrines that threaten punishment for disbelief spread more effectively? A hypothesis one could investigate sociologically. And indeed, researchers have documented phenomena like high-fertility religious groups outpacing others, or how strict religions that demand more from members often have higher retention and transmission, much as memetic theory predicts that costly memes can ensure devotion. In short, we don't treat memetics as gospel, pardon the irony. We treat it as a valuable heuristic that aligns with observable trends in cultural transmission. Another contention is the normative bias of the virus metaphor, that it offends believers and arguably labels all religion as bad by default. Here, Mystrikism walks a careful line. On one hand, we won't sugarcoat our view that false beliefs are bad for humanity in the long term, even if they feel good in the short term. In that sense, yes, we are not neutral about widespread supernatural conviction. We think it impedes our collective intellectual and ethical development. On the other hand, we do not view believers as mere infected drones, devoid of dignity or reason. We recognize that calling someone's cherished faith a virus will feel insulting, and thus it's often strategically unwise if the goal is dialogue. A Mystrik would therefore use this rhetoric more in analytical writing, to challenge the idea in principle, than in personal conversation. The intent is not to dehumanize, but to dramatically illustrate that even beloved traditions can carry harmful memetic code, for example, the idea that doubting is evil or that outsiders are damned. We also acknowledge that many positive ideas also spread contagiously. Love, science, and human rights can all be seen in memetic terms. The difference, we argue, is that positive, evidence-based ideas earn their spread by being valid when scrutinized, whereas religion often spreads because it discourages scrutiny. This is a key ethical distinction. For example, teaching the germ theory of disease also relies on transmission, schools, media, and so on, but we welcome it because it's supported by evidence and saves lives. Teaching that praying to Saint X will cure disease also spreads socially, but that claim is objectively unsubstantiated and potentially deadly if believed exclusively. Both are memes, but one aligns with reality and one with wishful thinking. Thus, calling religion a mind virus isn't to say all spreading ideas are bad. It's to emphasize that this particular class of ideas, supernatural doctrines, propagates through exploiting human cognitive blind spots rather than through merit. In a just and enlightened society, truth would be the factor that determines an idea's survival, not how well it can hijack our fears and hopes. Mystrikism fights for that ideal by both bolstering our mental immune system, educating critical thinking, skepticism, scientific literacy, and by exposing the tactics by which faith memes avoid rational critique, for instance, by sacralizing themselves, threatening dissenters, or cloaking themselves in virtue. If the language of viruses shocks some into re-examining how religions operate, it has done its job. However, we always pair this blunt analysis with a message of understanding. We know why these memes are attractive, and we believe humanity must transcend them for the sake of truth and moral progress. In summary, Mystrikism embraces the memetic framework as one instrument in our analytical toolkit. It aligns perfectly with our naturalistic worldview to consider religion an evolved cultural phenomenon rather than a divine given. We agree with critics that we must handle this tool carefully, not to reduce all facets of faith to just brainwashing, and not to strip individuals of agency in our narratives. We thus integrate memetics with empathy, understanding that even if someone is infected with a toxic idea, you cure them not by contempt, but by information and compassion. Indeed, just as in medicine, the language of contagion invites a humanitarian response. You fight the disease, but you care for the patient. So, while others worry the virus metaphor is dehumanizing, we find it actually fosters compassion if used wisely. It says, believers are not bad or stupid. They have caught a set of ideas through natural social processes. And like any deeply embedded condition, curing it takes patience, evidence, and kindness. Our ultimate loyalty is to truth and well-being. If an idea, meme or not, is untrue and causes harm, we are duty-bound to challenge it. If that ruffles feathers, we will do so as gently as possible. Still, we will not abdicate our responsibility to call out mind viruses that spur injustice, be it holy wars, science denial, or social oppression justified by Scripture. Through education, our vaccine for misinformation, and open dialogue, Mystrikism strives to inoculate minds against seductive falsehoods. We envision a cultural ecosystem where good ideas, grounded in evidence and empathy, outcompete the bad, not by coercion, but by virtue of being demonstrably better for human flourishing. The memetic perspective ultimately reinforces this mission. It reminds us that bad ideas won't just die out on their own. Better ones must actively outcompete them. In that spirit, we don't seek to punish carriers of religious memes, but to convert them, not to our dogma, but to a mindset of free inquiry and grounded understanding. It's a slow, careful antidote to ages of viral superstition, and let's sometimes speak of viruses and contagion. It is only because we refuse to underestimate the tenacity of unfounded beliefs. We recognize they spread tenaciously, and so we respond with equal tenacity to spread critical thought. In the end, no analogy is perfect, but the religion as social contagion concept galvanizes Mystriks to treat irrational belief as something that can and should be systematically rooted out for the health of our society, just as we would aim to contain an epidemic for the health of our bodies. In summary, the social contagion framework is powerful for analyzing the propagation of religions and their self-perpetuating features. It meshes well with a naturalistic worldview by treating religion as an evolved phenomenon, but it can be reductive and value-laden. Mystrikism, with its emphasis on scientific inquiry and humility, would likely use memetic theory as one lens among many, helpful in generating hypotheses. For example, does this doctrine spread because it's psychologically catchy? But careful not to ignore the nuanced content and context of beliefs. Supernatural belief, pathology, contagion, or collective delusion, Part 3 of 5. Religion as a mass delusion. The third framing overlaps with the first two, but shifts focus to the truth, value, and rationality of religious belief on a mass scale. Is religion essentially a mass delusion? A widespread false belief that persists despite lack of evidence or logical foundation? This comparison likens religious belief to things like conspiracy theories, pseudoscience crazes, or other collective irrationalities. The difference from the mental illness hypothesis is that the emphasis here is not on individual pathology, but on group belief in something untrue or unproven. The difference from the Contagion model is the emphasis on irrationality and falsehood rather than the mode of spread. In short, this view holds that religious doctrines are factually unsubstantiated. For example, the existence of deities, miracles, and the afterlife. And yet, through social reinforcement and cognitive bias, large masses of people come to accept them. Essentially, a socially sanctioned delusional system. One of the most vocal proponents of calling religion a delusion is Richard Dawkins, again as the title of The God Delusion makes clear. Dawkins explicitly defines belief in God as a delusion in the clinical sense, a false belief held with conviction despite evidence. He and others often draw the analogy: if an isolated individual believed the exact same things that, say, a Christian or Hindu believes, hearing an inaudible voice, trusting in an unseen guardian, expecting miracles, we'd likely judge those beliefs as delusional. It is only the weight of tradition and numbers that prevents us from doing so. This sentiment is captured in the earlier Pirsig quote: "A lone claimant of a bizarre belief is insane, but if millions share it, we politely call it religion." Steven Pinker's remark that belief in a heavenly afterlife is malignant illustrates the perceived danger. If you think this life is just a stepping stone, you might undervalue real-world problems. In a way, the mass delusion framing is a moral critique. It suggests society is in the grip of a grand error that has tangible costs, from medieval witch hunts to modern faith-healing deaths. Some historians and social scientists have indeed compared episodes of intense religious fervor to episodes of collective mania or hysteria. For instance, the European witch persecutions of the 16th to 17th centuries are now often described as a mass delusion, where whole communities accepted the reality of witches and satanic conspiracies on scant evidence, leading to the execution of tens of thousands of innocents. There is also the phenomenon of doomsday cults. When an apocalyptic prophecy fails, rather than abandoning the belief, the group often doubles down, a classic display of collective cognitive dissonance documented by Leon Festinger in his study When Prophecy Fails. Such cases mirror how conspiracy theory groups react to falsification by rationalizing and strengthening their communal belief rather than conceding error. Cognitive parallels with conspiracy and pseudoscience. Modern research on conspiracy theories and paranormal beliefs has revealed interesting overlaps with religious belief. All these domains involve what psychologists call magical thinking, patternicity, or agency inference, the tendency to perceive intentional forces or patterns where none exist. A conspiracy theorist sees a secret cabal behind random events. A religious believer sees divine providence or spiritual warfare behind events. A superstitious person sees fate or karma. In each case, an unseen intentional agent is postulated. Studies have found that people who endorse conspiracies are also more likely to hold paranormal or supernatural beliefs and even have similar cognitive styles. For example, a recent study published in 2024 noted that a literalist style of interpreting information, whether in religion or other domains, was positively associated with conspiracy belief susceptibility. The authors suggested that processing religious claims in a concrete, uncritical way might correlate with similarly credulous attitudes toward conspiracy narratives. A meta-analysis of who believes conspiracy theories found that religiosity and belief in pseudoscience were modest positive predictors, alongside factors like schizotypal tendencies and lower analytical thinking. In short, a person inclined to accept supernatural claims on faith may also be inclined to accept allegations of a vast government cover-up or miracle cures with no evidence. Both involve an intuitive, emotionally driven reasoning style rather than a skeptical, evidence-based one. This doesn't mean all religious people believe conspiracies or vice versa, but there is a measurable overlap in mindset and susceptibility.
Consider also how conspiracy communities function similarly to religious sects.
They have prophets, whistleblowers or influencers, whose pronouncements are taken on faith, dogmas that resist falsification. Any contrary evidence is part of the cover-up. And a narrative of good versus evil. Something like the QAnon conspiracy in the U.S. developed quasi-religious overtones. QAnon adherents speak of a coming Great Awakening and treat Q's cryptic posts as scripture to be interpreted. Sociologists have likened QAnon to a new religious movement, essentially a mass delusion with political content. Similarly, pseudoscientific movements, flat earth societies, anti-vaccine propaganda groups, often rely on insulating believers from outside critique and encouraging them to treat skeptics as heretics or shills. In all these cases, group reinforcement is key. A person alone might doubt a bizarre claim, but in an echo chamber of fellow believers, the claim gains a semblance of legitimacy. Thus, a mass delusion can sustain itself by sheer social proof. Millions believe as I do, so we can't all be crazy, one thinks. This social reinforcement dynamic was observed in the classic work Extraordinary Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, 1841, by Charles Mackay, which catalogued historical manias from tulip bulb investment bubbles to alchemy crazes. Mackay's thesis was that entire crowds or nations can go mad together, believing the absurd until reality inevitably crashes in. Religion was not spared from such analyses. Thinkers in the Enlightenment, and after often insinuated that religious fervor was another example of collective madness, albeit one with a far longer lifespan than a financial bubble. Strengths of the mass delusion perspective. Advocates of this framework argue it is a brutally honest appraisal. Truth should not be decided by majority vote, and being widespread doesn't make a belief any less false. Some strengths of this view include highlights lack of evidence. By calling religion a delusion, one underscores the fact that core religious claims are unfalsified and often unfalsifiable. There is no empirical evidence for souls, miracles, or gods comparable to the evidence we require for ordinary claims. Thus, the delusion label demands we hold religion to the same standard of evidence as any other belief. From a scientific rationalist stance, this is a fair point. If someone today claimed a dead man rose from the grave after 3 days, we'd be highly skeptical, so we should apply the same skepticism to ancient resurrection stories. In Mystrikal terms, it's about intellectual honesty, treating sacred claims with the same doubt as we would treat UFO or ghost claims. Parity with other irrational beliefs. The framework normalizes the discussion of religion in the context of other widespread irrational phenomena. It encourages drawing lessons from how people are misled en masse in different areas. For example, why do intelligent people fall for conspiracy theories or cults? Research points to social identity needs, cognitive biases, and a lack of trusted information sources, among other factors. These factors can equally apply to why people become fundamentalist religious believers. The comparison can yield insights. For example, understanding that confirmation bias, privileging information that supports one's belief, is at play both when a flat earther dismisses NASA photos and when a young Earth creationist dismisses fossil evidence. Recognizing these shared cognitive pitfalls can inform strategies to promote critical thinking across the board. Moral clarity on extremism. Labeling certain beliefs as delusions is morally assertive, as it refuses to grant harmful ideas undue respect just because they are traditional. For instance, if a religious sect lets children die by forbidding medical care, the mass delusion framework would call that belief, that prayer alone, heals, a dangerous delusion outright, rather than deferring to cultural differences. In other words, it combats the special immunity religion has historically enjoyed from criticism. This can be important when beliefs cause clear harm or impede scientific progress. For example, denial of evolution, or climate science on religious grounds. By comparing it to conspiracy thinking, we categorize it as things that are not epistemically okay to believe without evidence. Historical explanatory power. Many past events are well explained as mass delusions. The aforementioned witch hunts are a strong example. At the time, courts, elites, and commoners all believed in a vast diabolical conspiracy causing misfortunes. With hindsight, we see it as a panic-induced collective delusion, similar to modern moral panics, except with a supernatural twist. Recognizing this parallel helps explain the zeal and cruelty of those times. They weren't simply evil people, but deluded by a powerful narrative. Similarly, some argue that specific religious revival movements, or even aspects of major religions, such as relic veneration or legends of saints, might be better understood as socially reinforced myths that came to be treated as reality. Criticisms and counter-arguments. There are also significant criticisms of calling religion a mass delusion. Insensitivity to context and meaning. Critics say this view is too reductionist and dismissive. Religion isn't just a set of propositional beliefs about the world that are either true or false, it's also practices, community, morality, and personal meaning. Even if one believes the factual claims are false, lumping the entire phenomenon under delusion ignores the subjective value and the complex reasons people are religious. It can come off as arrogant and culturally tone-deaf, a form of what some call intolerant atheism. From a compassionate standpoint, labeling someone's deepest source of comfort a delusion may not be the best way to encourage reflection. It often triggers defensiveness or offense. Not all religious belief is literal. Many religious individuals do not hold their beliefs in a rigid, literal way that would qualify as delusional conviction. There are moderate and liberal believers who interpret scriptures metaphorically or who accept scientific evidence. For example, theistic evolutionists. They might say, yes, perhaps these stories aren't literally true, but they convey moral truths or symbolize a higher reality. In such cases, calling their faith a delusion mischaracterizes their actual cognitive state. They are not convinced of a false material fact. They're engaging with myth and symbol. Philosophers of religion like Paul Tillich have long argued that religious language is ultimately symbolic, not the same kind of factual claim as the sky is blue. Thus, the delusion framework may fit fundamentalists who insist every miracle is historical, but it may not fit all believers. Cultural and clinical distinctions. As discussed earlier, psychiatry deliberately separates shared cultural beliefs from delusions. A shared false belief could be termed a folie imposée, or shared psychotic disorder in a small group, say a family that collectively believes the neighbors are witches. Still, when it comes to whole cultures, clinicians defer to anthropologists. The mass delusion framing blurs this, effectively saying an entire culture, take Christianity or Islam, is equivalent to a folie a millions. But clinically, that concept is almost meaningless. You can't hospitalize 1 billion people, nor would they meet other criteria of illness. So some scholars argue it's more useful to study how and why people find these beliefs compelling, the psychology of religion, the sociology of knowledge, rather than simply labeling huge swaths of humanity with the pathology label. Overlooking adaptive or rational elements. While religious beliefs may lack empirical support, they often persist because they serve functions or align with some intuitions. Dismissing them as madness might prevent us from understanding those functions. For instance, belief in divine justice, even if false, might reduce anxiety about the unfairness of life, helping people cope. Belief in a loving deity can provide attachment security for someone who feels alone. These are psychological benefits that a cold analysis of truth value might ignore. A Mystrik would acknowledge the emotional realities that make such beliefs attractive, even while not subscribing to the belief's content. Epistemic humility reminds us that humans, even rational ones, often hold some irrational beliefs. We all have cognitive biases and emotional needs. Thus, drawing too sharp a line between those deluded religious folks and sane, rational people might be misleading. Irrationality comes in degrees and flavors across all populations. Philosophical pushback. The concept of mass delusion has been critiqued by theologians and philosophers who argue that the rationalist atheist definition of evidence is not the only way to approach truth. For example, philosopher Alvin Plantinga contends that belief in God can be properly basic, justified by internal experience rather than empirical evidence, akin to how we accept logical axioms or memory. While a naturalist may reject such arguments, they highlight that the debate is not settled even in philosophy. Moreover, many philosophers have critiqued Dawkins and similar writers for lacking nuance about the epistemology of religious belief, accusing them of attacking only the crudest caricatures of faith. In academic philosophy of religion, outrightly calling all religion a delusion is rare. More often, the discussion is about whether belief is warranted or not, which is a finer distinction. Mystrikism maintains that truth matters above comfort or tradition, so the blunt question, is widespread religion a mass delusion, elicits a qualified yes. In practical epistemic terms, it is. That said, we fully absorb the critique that simply declaring religion equals delusion and stopping there would be reductive and counterproductive. We do not stop there. Context and meaning are crucial. We know religious faith is entwined with culture, identity, morality, and personal solace. But acknowledging those human facets doesn't require us to pretend the factual claims are on firm ground. Our retort is that one can value the human context while still labeling the unsupported belief content for what it is, a grand false narrative that many people earnestly accept. Calling it a delusion is not an attempt to erase the poetry or community of religion. It's a statement about epistemology. These beliefs do not align with reality as best we can determine. Mystrikism refuses to grant a special exemption from rational scrutiny just because a belief makes someone feel good or is shared by millions. We don't deny the comfort or meaning people derive. We assert that comfort taken in an illusion is inherently precarious and ethically dubious when it can influence decisions that affect real lives. If a large group believed rubbing a lucky charm cures cancer, we would rightly call it a mass delusion, even if it gave hope, and we would try to educate them on real medicine. Similarly, when billions believe in miracles, divine intervention, or an afterlife without evidence, we term it a mass delusion, not to insult, but to highlight the gulf between the belief and the evidence. Crucially, our approach to individuals is gentle and respectful. We don't walk into churches yelling, "You're all delusional." That would indeed trigger defensiveness and shut down dialogue, as critics warn. Instead, a mystrik might engage a believer by exploring why they believe and empathetically introducing doubt, treating them as a rational person who has embraced an irrational idea for understandable reasons. The final worldview stance, however, remains firm. No matter how much meaning or morality is woven into a religious system, its supernatural claims are still epistemically bankrupt. We can appreciate the art and community in religion and still judge its literal claims to be fanciful. In fact, we'd argue that truly respecting people means being honest with them. We respect believers enough to say, "We understand why you hold this belief, but we don't think you would if you had been given all the information and tools to question it. You deserve reality, even if it's challenging, because ultimately, reality is what we all have to deal with." In short, we separate the believer from the belief. A person may have profound reasons for clinging to a faith, and we honor their quest for meaning, but we still call a spade a spade. If the content of that faith claims virgin births and angelic dictations, those claims are delusional by any standard of evidence. Not all religious believers are literalists or equally deluded, and Mystrikism recognizes this spectrum. A liberal Christian who sees biblical stories as metaphors and accepts science is not in the same boat as a fundamentalist who rejects every scientific finding that conflicts with Scripture. It would indeed be unfair to paint both with the exact same brush of delusion. Mystrikism's stance here is one of degrees. The fundamentalist holds active delusions, firm false beliefs about empirical reality. In contrast, the liberal believer holds a softer, perhaps more diffuse, unfalsifiable belief, which is still unwarranted, but closer to a philosophical worldview with unproven assumptions than a concrete delusion about, say, talking snakes or faith healing. We still challenge the liberal believer. For instance, if they claim, "I believe in a higher power" as a metaphor for love, we'd ask, why call it a power at all? Why not just embrace love as a human emotion? If they say, Scripture is symbolic, we ask, symbolic of what exactly? Couldn't we find those meanings without the supernatural gloss? In doing so, we're addressing the residue of delusion even in moderate religion, the subtle insistence that something supernatural or mystical underpins reality, even if not in naive literal terms. Mystrikism gently pushes back on that, promoting a worldview where meaning and ethics don't require any hidden metaphysical entities. However, we concede that the urgency and tone of our critique vary depending on how literally a person's beliefs conflict with reality. Someone who prays instead of taking their child to the doctor is in the grip of a dangerous delusion that must be confronted head-on. Someone who prays in addition to seeking medical help, essentially using prayer as emotional support, is less immediately hazardous. We'd still encourage them to credit the medicine, not divine intervention, for the cure. Still, we recognize they are not outright rejecting evidence. Thus, mystrics apply a scalpel, not a sledgehammer. The term mass delusion is a broad category, but within it, we discern the nuances. We are humble about human irrationality, knowing we all harbor some illogical beliefs or habits. This humility actually fuels our compassion. It reminds us that we're all in the same boat, prone to bias. So when we call religious belief a delusion, it's with the implicit addendum, and we too must be careful, for we might fall for other delusions more easily than we think. In practice, that means a mystrik never approaches a theist with smug superiority, but instead with an appeal. Come, let's examine our beliefs together. I too want to believe as many true things and as few false things as possible, don't you? By framing it as a shared journey toward truth, instead of an accusation of madness, we uphold respect, even while asserting that believing without evidence is a mistake. The cultural and clinical distinction is a fair point. You can't diagnose an entire faith community with a DSM condition, but Mystrikism would argue this is essentially a semantic issue, not a substantive exoneration of the belief's falsity. We are not suggesting literally committing whole populations to asylums. We are using delusion in the colloquial sense that Dawkins and others have invoked to mean a fixed false belief held despite lack of evidence or even despite evidence to the contrary. In that sense, the shoe fits. Billions believe propositions about reality, creation, afterlife, miracles, with zero empirical evidence. Many hold these as non-negotiable truths. By everyday definitions, that is delusional thinking, even if it's a socially orchestrated, conditioned kind of delusional thinking. From a sociological or anthropological view, one might prefer terms like mythos or shared cultural narrative, instead of delusion to be more neutral. But Mystrikism, coming from a scientific rationalist angle, doesn't shy from the value judgment that those narratives are not just different, but wrong. We see a direct line from mass delusion to mass harm. Consider how genuinely believing false ideas about the world has led to concrete atrocities. Witch hunts were predicated on a false belief in witches, jihads and crusades on false beliefs about God's will, families refusing polio vaccines due to false rumors, cult mass suicides waiting for non-existent prophecies. These aren't abstract concerns. They demonstrate that when whole cultures buy into unfounded beliefs, the results can be devastating. So while clinicians won't label an entire religion psychotic, a Mystrik will label the beliefs as toxic misinformation and the phenomenon as collective irrationality. Our focus, indeed, is on studying how and why people find these beliefs compelling. Precisely so, we can figure out how to offer better alternatives. We don't think simply slapping the word delusion ends the discussion. Instead, it begins one. If these cherished beliefs are likely false, what psychological and social voids are they filling? And how can we fill those voids in reality-honoring ways? That approach combines the anthropologist's empathy with the scientist's skepticism. Critics rightly remind us that religious belief often persists because it serves emotional or adaptive functions. Mystrikism doesn't downplay those functions. In fact, we spend a lot of effort understanding them. Belief in divine justice, for example, can indeed soothe the pain of earthly injustice. They will get their reckoning in the afterlife, thinks the downtrodden. But where the critic might use this as a defense of religion, see, it helps people cope. Don't call it madness. Mystrikism flips it into a moral challenge. If people are clinging to possibly false hopes of cosmic justice, we must work all the harder to create real justice here on earth. If someone endures hardship by fantasizing about heaven, how much better it would be if we as a society alleviated hardship so that no one needs to retreat into fantasy. We regard the psychological crutches of religion with compassion, much as a doctor considers a patient's use of an ineffective home remedy. One understands why they use it. Still, one doesn't therefore endorse the placebo as equal to real medicine. The better path is to provide a cure that renders the placebo unnecessary. So yes, calling a comforting belief delusional without offering an alternative source of comfort would be callous. Mystrikism's task is to show that the wonders of reality, supportive human relationships, and the pursuit of truth can provide equal, if not greater, comfort than the old stories of angels and demons. We strive to replace the false promises, for example, you'll meet your loved ones in heaven, or karma will punish the wicked, with efforts to improve life before death and promote justice tangibly. And when it comes to existential anxieties, fear of death, need for meaning, we offer a philosophy of finding meaning in the natural world and our shared humanity, a meaning that doesn't depend on unverifiable other worlds. In doing so, we address the function of the belief, the emotional need, in an evidence-based way, thereby undercutting the strongest reason people have to hold on to the untrue belief. Philosophical pushback against the mass delusion label also deserves a response. Some theologians and philosophers argue that religious belief operates in a different epistemic space, that evidence and reason, as used in science, aren't the only ways to truth, that faith can be properly basic or justified by personal experience. Mystrikism is unabashedly on one side of this philosophical debate. We contend that any truth which cannot be interrogated by evidence is not a truth at all, but a fancy or a subjective sentiment. The notion of different ways of knowing is often invoked to shield beliefs from scrutiny. We counter that with what we call epistemic justice, treating like claims alike. If someone claims to have an invisible friend guiding them, we don't accept that claim from a person with schizophrenia. We recognize it as a likely hallucination unless proven otherwise. If a mystic claims an invisible God is guiding them, why should we use a totally different standard, simply because it's culturally normative? That, to us, is an inconsistency born of social convenience, not truth-seeking integrity. We are aware that calling all of religion delusional is rare in academic philosophy. Philosophers prefer more polite terms like unjustified or discuss whether there are defeaters for belief in God. Mystrikism isn't ignorant of those nuanced debates. We find that at the end of the day, when stripped of jargon, belief without evidence, especially in propositions that make claims about reality, is irrational by definition. Plantinga's idea of God as a properly basic belief, one you're justified in holding without evidence unless proven otherwise, is, in our view, a clever rationalization that can be used to justify any fantastical belief if one so chooses. It's dangerous because it grants a blank check to the imagination. It's also telling that different religions and cults claim incompatible inner truths with equal conviction, a clear sign that personal conviction is no arbiter of actual truth. Thus, while we engage with philosophy respectfully, we don't let sophisticated excuses undermine our core principle. Extraordinary claims demand extraordinary evidence, or at least some evidence. Until that standard is met, calling a spade, labeling unfounded convictions as delusions, is intellectually honest. We do temper the word with compassion and use it carefully, but we do use it. After all, as critics themselves note, there is continuity between mild irrational beliefs and extreme ones. Mystrikism sees religious belief on a continuum of human credulity, rather than a categorically separate realm. On one end, you have benign superstitions and cognitive biases we all share, avoiding the number 13 or a gut feeling that everything happens for a reason when it's just randomness. On the far end, you have full-fledged delusional systems like QAnon cultism or violently apocalyptic sects. Religion spans the middle, moderate believers with a few supernatural inklings, all the way to fundamentalists convinced the end times are nigh. It's all part of a spectrum of moving away from evidential reasoning. Recognizing this helps us remain humble. We all have our blind spots, but also resolute. Widespread acceptance doesn't grant a belief special, immunity from being on that spectrum. Finally, Mystrikism addresses the fear that calling religion an illness or delusion is inherently disrespectful or arrogant. Our intention is not to wield those words as insults, but as diagnoses of a pervasive human challenge. We use strong language at times because history shows tiptoeing around the truth can let corrosive falsehoods fester. However, we pair our frank diagnosis with a prescription rooted in empathy. We do not seek to eradicate religion by force or coercion, nor to scorn believers into silence. Such approaches would be unethical and likely backfire. Instead, we champion education, open dialogue, and the power of example. We aim to live fulfilling, meaningful lives without superstition, to show others it's possible. We protect the rights of all, including the religious, even as we criticize beliefs. Justice demands no less, and we practice what we preach in terms of epistemic humility, constantly checking that our beliefs stand up to evidence too. If tomorrow solid proof of some deity emerged, a true mystrik would change their view, because our loyalty is to truth, not pride. In this way, we hope to demonstrate that our rejection of the supernatural isn't a knee-jerk disdain for tradition or comfort, but a principled commitment to integrity, not lying to ourselves about what is real, and compassion, caring enough about people to want them to orient their lives around reality so they don't suffer avoidable harms or deceptions. Yes, we speak of curing the world of irrational belief, and that can sound patronizing, but consider the stakes. When large segments of society believe false things, the collective decisions we make about the environment, public health, social policy can be dangerously misguided. Think of climate change denial, often fueled by religious or pseudoscientific delusions, or fatalistic attitudes that the apocalypse is coming anyway, so why preserve Earth? These show that mass delusion can become an existential threat. Given that, our fervor in labeling and combating delusion is not born of elitism. It's born of urgent concern for our shared future. We genuinely believe humanity cannot afford to indulge in fantasies en masse without consequence. In conclusion, the Mystrikal worldview stands by the essence of the mass delusion critique of supernatural belief, but infuses it with humanity. We call out the falsehood for what it is, a widespread cultural mirage, while deeply understanding that people cling to that mirage for real, poignant reasons. Our ultimate goal is to address those reasons head-on, to foster a society where no one needs to believe in magic to find hope, meaning, or morality. In such a society, religion's spell would naturally break, not through force, but through enlightenment and the availability of better answers. Until then, we will use every rational tool at our disposal to hasten that dawn. Principled disgust will fuel our refusal to tolerate cruelty or injustice excused by faith. We will call out wrongdoing even if wrapped in sanctity. Justice will guide us to ensure our advocacy never strips away people's dignity or rights. We fight ideas, not people, and our compassion will remind us that we are doctors, not inquisitors, healing minds, not punishing them. So when we say billions are in the grip of an untrue belief system, we say it with sorrow and determination, not malice. The word delusion is sharp, but sometimes a precise incision is needed to drain an infection. Our rhetoric can be strong, but it is matched by a strong love for humanity's potential. We believe that potential is better served unshackled from ancient illusions. Thus, the final Mystrikal retort to the counter-arguments is this. However one frames the issue, illness, contagion, or delusion, the prevalence of supernatural belief is a profound dysfunction of our species' epistemology, one that we seek to remedy for the greater good. We will do so with open hearts, but also open eyes, never losing sight of the fact that a false comfort, sustained over generations, is still a falsehood, and ultimately, humanity can only thrive by facing reality as it is. Overlap with non-pathological but irrational beliefs.
An important insight from the mass delusion viewpoint, one compatible with Mystrikism's humility, is that religious belief lies on a continuum of everyday irrationality that most humans exhibit. We all hold some beliefs that aren't strictly rational. For example, consider common superstitions, an athlete's lucky socks, or a student's ritual of using a special pen on exam day. These have no real effect, yet they persist because they relieve anxiety, or because one time it seemed to work, reinforcing the belief. No one would call these mild superstitions a mental illness. They are typical cognitive byproducts of how our brains find patterns and seek control. Scale that up, and you get socially embedded superstitions like belief in astrology. Mercury is in retrograde, that's why I have bad luck, or belief in evil eye curses. Widespread, culturally transmitted false beliefs that individuals may half believe or believe in specific contexts. Religion can be seen as a grander version, a complex of superstitions and myths, elevated by tradition and institutional power, but still fundamentally unsupported by evidence. In that sense, it's continuous with other human fallacies, rather than a wholly separate category. This perspective encourages compassion. Just as we wouldn't mock a person for nervously knocking on wood, we understand it's a harmless comfort even, if irrational. Perhaps we can understand why someone prays for help in a crisis. The belief might be scientifically unfounded, but it serves a psychological purpose. The goal from a rationalist stance would be to gently educate and offer alternative coping methods, rather than deride the belief as lunacy.
Supernatural belief, pathology, contagion, or collective delusion, Part 4 of 5. Comparison of frameworks and reception. Each of the above frameworks, mental illness, social contagion, mass delusion, offers a distinct angle on the complex reality of religious belief. How are these ideas received in scientific and philosophical communities, and where do they overlap or conflict? In scientific communities. Broadly, scientists who study religion, psychologists, neurologists, sociologists, and so on, tend to approach it as a natural phenomenon without rushing to label it pathological. The mental illness model finds little support in official psychology. As we saw, the DSM and psychiatric literature take pains to separate normal faith from pathology. Most researchers instead investigate how religious beliefs form, what cognitive processes are involved, and what effects they have on behavior and health. The contagion/memetic model is intriguing to some scientists, especially those inclined toward evolutionary explanations. It's common in evolutionary psychology or cognitive science of religion to talk about why specific religious ideas are catchy or sticky in human minds. However, the stricter Dawkins-style virus rhetoric is more often found in popular science writing and new atheist advocacy than in peer-reviewed research. Scientists might use neutral terms like cultural transmission or meme without implying that these are diseases. The mass delusion framing, being somewhat polemical, is likewise not a formal scientific theory, but a perspective held by some outspoken scientists. Researchers do study analogies between religious belief and other belief systems, like conspiracy belief, and find empirical correlations. For example, analytic thinking tends to reduce both religiosity and conspiracy belief, while intuitive thinking correlates with both. These findings suggest that similar cognitive biases underlie various unfounded beliefs. So in that sense, science acknowledges overlaps with delusion-like thinking patterns. But most scientists would stop short of saying, therefore religion equals pathology. Instead, the trend is to view religion as an emergent property of normal cognitive functions. For example, as a byproduct of agency detection, theory of mind, storytelling, and social bonding mechanisms that usually serve us well but can also produce fantastical beliefs. This byproduct view was mentioned at the Bristol Explaining Religion conference that Blackmore attended. Many scholars there argued that religions are byproducts of normal cognition, or even adaptive features, rather than viral parasites. In summary, the scientific community is interested in explaining religion's origins and effects, naturalistically, but cautious about blanket normative claims like, it's a mental disorder. In philosophical and skeptical discourse. Among philosophers and public intellectuals, opinions are polarized. The new atheist thinkers, Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, have popularized the notion that religion is a pernicious delusion or meme. They have been influential in sparking public debate, but within academic philosophy of religion, their approach is often criticized as unsophisticated. Religious philosophers, and even some secular philosophers, argue that these authors conflate fundamentalism with all religion, or that they ignore philosophical arguments for God's existence and the rich symbolic language of faith. For instance, critics point out that calling religion a delusion presupposes a strict evidentialism that not everyone shares. A theologian might respond that God's existence isn't a scientific hypothesis, but a different kind of claim, a move which a naturalist like a Mystrik would still challenge, but it shows the philosophical contention. Some philosophers, such as Michael Martin and Delos McCown, secular philosophers, have entertained the religion as delusion idea in academic work, but it remains a minority view in scholarly literature. More common are analyses of religious belief using epistemology, rationality, justification, without equating it outright with insanity. Overlap and differences. The three frameworks we explored are not mutually exclusive. They zoom in on different aspects. One can see religion as psychologically compelling to the point of pathology in some cases. Mental illness angle, widely transmitted through social/biological evolution, contagion angle, and epistemically unfounded, delusion angle, all at once. In fact, they can complement each other. The reason religious beliefs act like contagions may be because they exploit our mental architecture, susceptibility to certain rewarding delusions. A person in the grip of a fervent religious experience might exhibit symptoms that, to a psychiatrist, look like mania or obsession. Meanwhile, that person's zeal might spread to peers through emotional contagion, so one could craft a synthetic narrative. For example, religious memes act like infectious delusions, hijacking normal brain's bias for comforting, supernatural explanations. This kind of integrative statement would capture elements of all three hypotheses. However, one must be careful. Such phrasing is very loaded and would be highly disputed by others who see religion in more appreciative terms as a source of ethics, art, community, and so on, not just a mind virus. critically evaluating strengths, limitations, to compare directly. The pathology model is strong in explaining extreme forms of religiosity, for example, cultic suicide pacts, self-harming rituals, hearing voices, in terms of mental health, and it raises the valid point that normalizing certain delusional ideas via religion doesn't make them true. Its weakness is that it fails to account for the billions of moderate believers who don't display clinical symptoms and often derive benefits from belief. It's also somewhat at odds with clinical practice and risks medicalizing a social phenomenon. The social contagion/meme model shines in analyzing how religions spread and persist across generations. It aligns with evolutionary thinking and identifies concrete mechanisms, imitation, threats, promises, and so on, that give religion its resilience. Its drawback is a possible cynicism or reductionism, treating humans as mere hosts and ignoring the content of religious teachings, which can include compassion, social justice, philosophy, aspects that a virus view doesn't easily explain people valuing. Empirically, it is challenged by cases where religion seems adaptive or positive. The mass delusion model takes a firm rationalist stance, reminding us that the popularity of a belief is no proof of its truth. It usefully places religious claims on the same plane as any other claim, subject to scrutiny and skepticism. It also calls attention to the dangerous consequences of false beliefs. However, it tends to downplay the spectrum of belief and the social context, treating all believers as if they wholeheartedly accept the most fantastical claims literally, which is not always the case. It may overestimate the power of reason alone to undo these delusions, when in reality emotional and social factors are deeply entwined. Supernatural belief, pathology, contagion, or collective delusion, Part 5 of 5. Mystrikal worldview perspective. From the viewpoint of Mystrikism, prioritizing scientific naturalism and compassion, none of these frameworks is a complete answer, but each holds some truth. A Mystrik would agree that supernatural claims lack empirical support, so in that sense, yes, they are delusion-like, or at least not grounded in reality. We would also agree that such beliefs likely arise from natural causes, the architecture of the brain, evolutionary forces, and social reinforcement. Thus, the supernatural is rejected as an explanation, but the human needs driving belief are acknowledged. Epistemic humility reminds us that we too could fall prey to comforting illusions. The difference is that we strive to test our beliefs against evidence continually. True epistemological justice means holding all claims, even culturally cherished ones, to the same standard of evidence. We cannot exempt traditional beliefs from scrutiny simply because they are widespread. The ethic of honesty means we shouldn't lie to ourselves about supernatural claims. We should courageously face the possibility that these are human-made stories. The ethic of compassion means that when we encounter believers, we seek to understand the psychological comfort or community they derive from their faith, rather than dismissing them as irrational or labeling them insane. We care about people's well-being without granting impunity to harmful falsehoods. We identify and address irrational beliefs while treating the believer with respect. Mystrikism fully recognizes that religion can offer real community, comfort, and moral support. However, these benefits stem from human connection and shared values, not from any provable supernatural truth. In other words, people thrive through social bonds and meaning, which can be preserved without false beliefs. Instead of pathologizing individual believers, a Mystrik might focus on educating and informing, much as one would approach someone who believes in a conspiracy theory. Patiently present facts, encourage critical thinking, and create an environment where it's safe to question one's group's doctrines. Mystriks feel a principled disgust toward the injustices and suffering caused by faith-based errors. Compassion for individuals does not lead us to condone harm. We will call out cruelty or injustice, even if it is wrapped in sanctity. In our moral calculus, comfort is not an absolute good if it comes at the cost of truth or innocent well-being. Ultimately, whether one prefers the term illusion, Freud's softer term, or delusion, Dawkins's sharper term, the Mystrikal stance is that truth matters. Even if a belief is comforting, if it's false, we aim to gently expose that falsehood and replace the comfort with something more reality-based, for example, community and meaning, grounded in shared human values and the wonder of the natural universe. We recognize that mass irrational beliefs are a recurring feature of humanity, be it in religion, cults, or secular ideologies, and so we remain humble, knowing that reason is a hard-won achievement. We advocate remaining ever vigilant about our own biases and blind spots. Conclusion. Framing religion as mental illness, social contagion, or mass delusion, each captures an aspect of why scientifically minded observers find traditional supernatural beliefs problematic. These frameworks have illuminated certain truths. Religious fervor can mirror psychopathology in extreme cases. Religious ideas do spread through societies in ways that can be analogized to infectious diseases. And many core religious claims, to a rational skeptic, appear no more evidenced than do conspiracy theories or other delusions. Each theory, however, also faces strong criticisms, underscoring that religion is a multifaceted human phenomenon, not easily reduced to a single category. In scientific and philosophical circles, outrightly classifying religion as a disease or delusion remains controversial. While a growing body of research treats religious belief as a natural cognitive phenomenon, subject to bias and social influence, there is also recognition that it performs enduring social and psychological functions. The debate often reflects one's underlying values, a commitment to strict naturalism and evidentialism versus an appreciation for the symbolic and communal dimensions of faith. From the mystical perspective, rooted in naturalism and compassion, we conclude that supernatural and religious beliefs are products of the human mind, not external realities. They arise from our mental architecture and our cultural stories, and in that sense, they can be deemed illusions. Yet, we do not say this with the intent to mock or trivialize the profound role they play in people's lives. Instead, we pair our commitment to truth with an understanding of why these comforting delusions took hold. Humans fear death, seek meaning, crave justice, and often feel small in a chaotic world. Religion has been a psychologically natural response to these existential dilemmas. As we advance, the challenge and hope is that humanity can outgrow the need for false answers without dismissing the needs themselves. Science and reason can illuminate real answers, however incomplete, to replace the supernatural ones, and secular communities can provide belonging and moral frameworks to replace religious congregations. In Freud's optimistic words, perhaps turning away from religion will occur as a natural process of growth, but it must be accompanied by turning toward knowledge, empathy, and ethical living. By understanding religion through the critical frameworks above, we arm ourselves against credulity and aim to prevent the harms of mass delusion. We agree with the Mystrikal insight that humanity cannot afford to indulge in fantasies en masse without consequence. Belief without evidence is not merely irrational. When promoted, it becomes socially harmful. Deliberately spreading unsupported doctrines undermines collective well-being and must be challenged. At the same time, by acknowledging the psychological and social complexities, we ensure our critique of religion remains humane. For clarity, being humane does not mean soft-pedaling the truth or tolerating dangerous falsehoods. We will call out wrongdoing even if wrapped in sanctity, firmly contesting harmful ideas while still respecting individuals. Our language may be strong, the word delusion can be sharp, but it is used with great love for humanity. In sum, religion may not literally be a mental illness, a virus, or a collective psychosis. But analyzing it in those terms, carefully and with nuance, helps us grapple with its hold on the human mind and imagine a future guided more by reality and compassion than by illusion. In the end, Mystrikism insists on a future guided by truth, justice, and compassion. As one summary puts it, a widespread supernatural belief is a profound dysfunction of our species' epistemology, one that we seek to remedy for the greater good. We do so with open hearts and open eyes, believing that humanity can only thrive by facing reality as it is.